As you venture into your digital marketing career, you'll eventually wonder if you should work for one brand, i.e. client side, or work for multiple brands, i.e. agency side. So as someone who's been in both sides and I've seen the pros and cons of both environments, hopefully I can shed some light into helping you decide whatever your next chapter is. You want to first be conscientious of what exactly are you looking for in terms of your next chapter. That could either be working for one brand or working for multiple brands. Let's talk about the pros and cons of each. Starting with client-side pros, the first one being you get to onboard a lot more smoothly and you get to really learn the intricacies of the business, right? So as opposed to working in an agency where you're managing multiple brands, you don't really get to understand each of those brands inside out. Whereas when you're working client-side, as you onboard, you get to really work with a lot of different departments of the company itself. And part of that entails you understanding your role and how it impacts the business a lot more in depth than if you were in an agency. The second pro of working client side is that you get to really systemize and focus in your own role. And the longer you stay within the company, the easier it becomes. You start to create ways of working because you know your role inside out. You'll likely work with the same people. I find that in an agency environment, the churn rate for employees is a lot higher compared to client side. So in that sense, as mentioned, you get to really integrate with your team and the business and hopefully your line manager or your boss, which makes it easier to work when you know exactly what you're going to do every day in, day out. The job becomes easier. The final pro of working client side is your impact within the company is a lot more visible. It's a lot more pronounced, whereas if you're working with an agency, you tend to be very top line in the results that you provide the client or the brand. Whereas if you work internally for that brand, you really get to see the full pledge of a campaign activation, for example. So from ideation to strategy to planning all the way to activation and reporting, it's something that you can be a part of throughout the whole process. Your impact within the company is a lot more visible. So now let's talk about the cons of working client side. So the first con of working client side is that while you get to really master your role within the company, your upskilling is very limited, right? You're only exposed to one type of business vertical, and it's very likely you're going to be siloed within your department, especially as the company gets bigger. The more of a cog in the machine you are. The second con is that you're only going to be exposed to one business vertical or one brand, one type of business. Use case is if you work for a B2B company for a couple of years and then you transition into a direct-to-consumer business model, there might be some friction points there from the point of view of the employer or the hiring manager, right? So they're going to be asking you, so, John, you've worked in B2B and now you're transitioning into direct-to-consumer. How are you going to find that transition? Let me give you a bit of a hint. If they do ask that question, if they do mention how are you going to transition into a completely different business model when you've been working at a specific type of business model for the past couple of years. So what you say in that question is very simple. You say the way you do marketing is very process driven. It's very strategic, and that approach is viable across any type of business model. The only difference is that the audience segments that you're targeting and potentially the channels that you're using to reach those audiences are a lot different. And obviously the product and services that you sell is going to be different for different business models, but the process of marketing is exactly the same. And that's what I bring into the role. So the third and final con of working at a client side role is that your networking opportunity is slightly more limited as opposed to an agency side job, especially as the company gets bigger. You're going to be more of a cog in the machine. You're going to be siloed and you might only be working with the same exact people for a long period of time. As opposed to an agency, you're exposed to different teams, different brands almost on a daily basis. So now let's move on to agency side, starting with the first pro. You'll have the ability to work with multiple brands across different business verticals all at the same time. Now that's a pro because as a marketer, the more exposed you are to different business verticals, different brands, you really get to understand how a business works. You get to see how your marketing initiatives affect those types of businesses, and you can start to replicate those approaches to different roles, maybe in your own venture one day. The next pro is that you rapidly upskill when you work for an agency. The fact that you're working with multiple brands, it's very likely that they'll be having different ways of working, different ways of communicating. The clients that you're able to work with might have different personalities, they have different demands. So you're working on a lot of soft skills and hard skills. You might realize that one brand uses different tools for reporting, whereas another brand might have a different tech stack completely. So you get introduced to a lot of different tech stacks. The final pro of working in an agency is that you get to work on your presentation and communication skills. The fact that you're working in multiple brands with different personalities, you get to really hone in on working on how you present whatever your role is within the agency. So let's say for me, I specialize in performance marketing. I get to really work on how to explain if performance is currently down, or if it's doing really well, I'm able to justify why and have different ways of exposing that fact or that report. And in marketing, since it's a very subjective field, your ability to communicate and to present is a very important skill. And within an agency environment, because you're working with multiple brands, you get to practice that within different types of industries. So next is the cons of working for an agency. The first one being that it's very mentally taxing. It's very high pressure. So when you usually join an agency, there's not a lot of onboarding that happens. You're usually thrown in there with multiple brands or multiple accounts to work on. And if you like comfort, an agency environment isn't probably what I recommend. It's very fast-paced. You might be onboarding one client and then managing another client and then offboarding another client all at the same time, all within different types of business verticals. So in that sense, there's a lot of pressure working in an agency. The second con is you'll find this quite consistently because you're an agency providing service for another business. Your output within your role is quite limited. And what I mean by that is, let's say you might have amazing ideas for an initiative. Because you don't work in the company, a lot of what you say is an opinion from the point of view of the client, right? At the end of the day, you might be a specialist within your role. The person that gets the last say is really the business, or very likely the stakeholder that you're managing. And I find that working in an agency, you're really a glorified customer service rep, right? You're trying to please the client. You're trying to keep them or retain them within the business. And that is a KPI that's tied to you as an account manager within your specific role for the agency. So the final con of working for an agency is the fact that if you get to work with brands that you're not quite happy with, it's very hard to do your job, especially if there's a lot of misalignment or miscommunication with the client from their expectations to what you're able to provide. I remember a time, I won't mention the agency's name, I was working on an account where the client mentioned the fact that because we are an agency, that we should have the ability to do anything and everything. And obviously that isn't the case. In those situations, it's hard to really respond to a client. And so what usually happens is you become quite passive aggressive. That's just the nature of agency work, right? So hopefully if you do go the agency route, you get to work on some really cool brands and preferably a great team and more so a great client. To close off, if you're just starting out in marketing, it doesn't really matter as much whether you work for one brand or multiple brands in an agency environment. One of the three core pillars you want to understand before you venture into your next role is, one, what exactly are you looking to get out of your next role, and be very conscientious of what that is. Second is, whatever role you take on next has to fit into your overall career trajectory or your story. And finally, you want to work for a team and the hiring manager that you can really integrate and communicate effectively with, right? If there's friction there within your team, that's not going to be a good scenario, right? You're going to be with these people 5 days a week, and if you're not happy with your team, you're not going to enjoy your job. So one more thing, if you do decide to go client side, make sure that you believe in the proposition or the product or services that the company does sell, because it's hard to do marketing for a company that you don't quite believe in. I've had that mistake. Again, I won't mention what the brand or the company is. But yeah, just be very conscientious of your next step and make sure that you find the role exciting if you were to go client side. One final thing, the fact that there's no job security or there's no perfect job environment, I would highly urge you to always have some sort of a side or creative project that you're working on, and that can potentially turn into a business one day, or maybe it is a side business, and that will feed into your full-time job, and maybe one day you'd want to venture out and become an entrepreneur yourself. So always keep in mind, time and energy can be spread out beyond your job. And I would recommend doing that, especially the earlier you are in your career. You've got a lot more time to try out different things. So don't be afraid. If you enjoyed the video, I highly encourage you to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Peace.